The subway car rattled faintly as it sped through the dark, its fluorescent lights flickering intermittently. I leaned my head against the window, watching the city blur into abstract shapes of neon and shadow. I had been running on fumes all day, deadlines at work, a meeting that dragged too long, and an argument with a friend that left me too drained to call an Uber. The train was half empty at this hour, a rare reprieve from the usual crowds, and the gentle rocking of the car lulled me into a stupor. I didn't mean to fall asleep. When I opened my eyes, I was enveloped in silence. The train was still, parked in a station I didn't recognize. The lights inside the car buzzed faintly, flickering now with an almost deliberate irregularity. For a moment I thought I was dreaming. I blinked hard, but the unsettling quiet remained, pressing down on me like a weight. The station beyond the train windows was pitch black. No signs, no advertisements, no glowing track markers, just an impenetrable darkness that seemed alive, as if it were pulsing gently, almost breathing. I pulled out my phone, but the screen stayed blank, no matter how many times I tapped the power button. Something about the atmosphere made my chest tighten. I turned to the only other passenger in the car, a middle-aged man slumped over in his seat across the aisle. He was still, too still, but the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest told me he was asleep. I tried to focus, piecing together where I might be. Maybe I had missed my stop, or the train had been rerouted. It wasn't unheard of. But as I looked closer at the windows, my unease deepened. Silhouettes. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the more I stared, the clearer they became. Shadowy figures stood motionless on the platform outside, just barely visible against the faint interior glow of the subway car. Their shapes were distorted, not quite human, as though smeared along their edges. I couldn't make out any faces or clothing, just rows upon rows of these figures stretching into the dark, as far as I could see. I tapped the glass lightly, not sure what I was expecting. They didn't move. They didn't even seem to notice me. My breath fogged the window, and I wiped it away with my sleeve, leaning closer. The figures remained frozen, and a peculiar chill seeped into the air around me. The train doors didn't open. I stood, my pulse quickening, and tried the emergency release handle. It wouldn't budge. I yanked it harder, straining, but it felt as though it had fused with the metal frame. The man across the aisle stirred, a low groan slipping from his lips. "Hey," I said, my voice shaky. "Do you know where we are?" He didn't respond. His head rolled to the side, and his lips moved soundlessly, as if whispering to something just out of reach. I crossed the aisle, my footsteps muted against the floor. I reached out to shake his shoulder, but as soon as my hand touched him, his head snapped upright. His eyes flew open, wide and unseeing, and a strangled gasp tore from his throat. Hey, it's okay," I said, taking a step back. He blinked rapidly, his breath coming in shallow bursts. His gaze darted around the car, then settled on me. "Where are we?" he rasped. "I don't know," I admitted. The train stopped, but the doors won't open. There's something outside." He rubbed his temples, squinting at the windows. "What time is it?" "My phone's dead," I said. He fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a phone of his own. The screen glowed briefly, then flickered out. He cursed under his breath, shoving it back into his jacket. "This doesn't make sense." "I know," I said. "But look outside. Do you see them?" He turned his head slowly toward the windows. When his eyes locked onto the silhouettes, his entire body stiffened. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He took a shaky step backward, bumping into one of the seats. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. "I don't know," I said again, my voice thin. "They're just standing there." We both stared at the figures, neither of us daring to move. They didn't react, didn't shift or sway. It was as if they weren't alive, but something about them felt aware. "We have to get out of here," he muttered, his voice trembling. "I tried the doors," I said. "They won't open." "Then we break a window," he said, his tone sharpening with panic. He grabbed one of the fire extinguishers mounted near the end of the car and swung it hard at the nearest window. The glass didn't even crack. He hit it again, harder, his grunts echoing in the silent car, but the window remained unyielding. Stop, I said, glancing nervously at the figures outside. What if they hear us? He froze, the extinguisher still clutched in his hands. Slowly, his gaze returned to the windows. The figures hadn't moved, but something about their presence felt heavier, more oppressive, as if the air itself was thickening. We need to stay calm, I said, though my own voice wavered. There has to be an explanation. He let the extinguisher drop to the floor with a metallic clang, running a hand through his disheveled hair. This isn't an accident, he said. Someone did this. Someone's messing with us. Before I could respond, the train lights flickered again, plunging us into brief darkness. When they came back on, the man gasped audibly. The figures were closer. Not by much, but enough to notice. They were no longer confined to the platform. A few had stepped forward, their indistinct forms pressing against the windows like smudged fingerprints on glass. Oh God, the man whispered. I backed away instinctively, my heart pounding. Did they? They moved, he said, his voice barely audible. They're moving. The oppressive silence grew deeper, swallowing the faint hum of the train's machinery. I felt a low vibration in the floor, like the distant rumble of thunder, but it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from below. Then the lights flickered again, and everything went black. For a moment, all I could hear was my own panicked breathing. Then, faintly, the sound of footsteps. Not just one pair, but many. They echoed faintly, uneven and deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth just out of sight. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere at once, growing louder, closer. I pressed myself against the wall of the car, clutching the edge of a seat for support. "Do you hear that?" the man asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, though I doubted he could see me in the dark. The lights flickered back on, stuttering weakly, and my stomach dropped. The figures were inside the train. The figures were inside the train, scattered throughout the car as though they had always been there. They didn't lurch or stalk, they simply stood. Their forms were indistinct, shimmering slightly like heat waves rising from asphalt. Though they had no discernible faces, I could feel their attention, an overwhelming sense that every single one of them was focused on me. The man let out a strangled cry and stumbled backward, tripping over one of the seats. He hit the ground hard, but he didn't move to get up. His wide, terrified eyes were fixed on the nearest figure. "What? Are they?" he croaked, his voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was too tight, my chest constricted as though the very air had been siphoned away. Slowly, I slid my gaze to the door at the far end of the car. If I could reach it, just maybe I could run to another car, find a way out, or at least put distance between myself and them. One of the figures shifted slightly, a ripple of movement that sent a jolt of icy dread down my spine. It wasn't much, just a faint tilt of its head, or what I thought might be a head, but it was enough to send me scrambling. I didn't think. I just moved. I sprinted for the door, my footsteps echoing in the eerie stillness. My hands fumbled with the latch, shaking uncontrollably as I tried to yank it open. It wouldn't budge. The man behind me was sobbing now, a low, broken sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. "They're watching us," he whispered. "They're watching us." I turned back, heart hammering in my chest. The figures hadn't moved closer, but the air around them seemed thicker, darker, as though they were drawing the shadows into themselves. The man suddenly lunged forward, his panic overtaking him. He grabbed my arm, his nails digging into my skin. "Help me," he shouted. "We have to get out of here." "I'm trying," I snapped, yanking my arm free. But his sudden movement had drawn their attention. The figures turned, all of them in perfect unison. It was subtle at first, like a shift in the tide, but then the shadows around them began to writhe and churn. The closest figure stepped forward, its form dissolving and reforming with each movement, as though it wasn't entirely bound to this plane. "No, no, no," the man whimpered, backing away. I hammered at the door again, desperate, frantic, but it was no use. The latch was frozen, immovable. I turned back to the man just in time to see one of the figures reach for him. Its hand, or what passed for a hand, extended, elongating unnaturally as it brushed against his shoulder. He screamed. It was a sound I'll never forget, raw and guttural, filled with a terror so primal it made my stomach churn. His body convulsed violently, his back arching as though every muscle in him was seizing at once. And then, as abruptly as it started, the screaming stopped. He collapsed to the floor, limp and lifeless. The figure that had touched him recoiled slightly, as if withdrawing something from him, and its form seemed more defined now, more solid. I stared at the man's body, my mind struggling to process what I had just witnessed. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling, but his face, it was hollow, drained of all color and vitality. A faint sound broke through my daze, a whisper, low and almost melodic. It wasn't coming from the man or the figures. It was coming from the shadows themselves, a cacophony of voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. And then the lights went out again. This time the darkness was absolute. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me, filling every corner of the car. I pressed myself against the door, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Something brushed past me. It was cold, impossibly cold, like the air in a crypt. I flinched, spinning blindly in the dark, but there was nothing there. My heart felt like it was about to burst, the fear so intense it was almost physical. The whispers suddenly stopped. For a moment there was nothing but silence. And then, faintly, I heard it, the sound of a train horn, distant but growing louder. The floor beneath me vibrated, and a dim light began to flicker through the windows. It wasn't the sterile fluorescent glow of the subway car. It was red, pulsing like a heartbeat, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. The train wasn't moving, but something was coming. The figures were still there, motionless but undeniably present. They seemed to be waiting, their forms silhouetted against the pulsing red light. I didn't know what was approaching, but every instinct screamed at me to get away. I stumbled toward the emergency exit at the rear of the car, my hands groping in the dark. And then I heard it. A voice. It wasn't a whisper, but a low, resonant tone that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It spoke a single word, one that I didn't understand but felt deep in my bones. As the word echoed through the car, the figures began to move. The figures moved with a deliberate slowness, their distorted shapes gliding through the car. They didn't walk like people. There was no rhythm, no weight to their movements, just a smooth, unnatural fluidity that made my skin crawl. I stumbled backward, my hands scrabbling for the emergency release latch at the end of the car. My fingers finally found it, and I yanked with everything I had. The latch gave way with a metallic snap, and the doors slid open an inch before jamming. Red light flooded through the narrow gap, searing and pulsating. For a moment I thought I could see something beyond the door, a blur of jagged shapes and roiling darkness, but the sight was so disorienting that I had to look away. Behind me, the figures were closing in. I shoved my shoulder against the door, gritting my teeth as I forced it open just wide enough to squeeze through. The moment I stepped onto the metal platform connecting the train cars, a deafening roar filled the air. It wasn't a mechanical sound, not the hum of an approaching train. It was alive, guttural, like the howl of some immense creature. The red light pulsed brighter, and the vibration in the floor intensified, rattling my bones. The next car was just ahead, its door closed. I threw myself at it, slamming into the cold metal and fumbling for the handle. My hands were slick with sweat, my breath coming in shallow gasps, but I managed to pull it open and stumble inside. The new car was identical to the one I had just left, same rows of seats, same flickering lights, but it felt different. The air was heavier, colder, and the oppressive silence was pierced by faint whispers that seemed to emanate from nowhere. I turned to close the door behind me, but it was too late. One of the figures was already on the platform, its amorphous form blotting out the red light. It moved with a horrifying speed, gliding toward me as though propelled by an unseen force. I slammed the door shut just in time, the lock clicking into place with a sharp snap. For a moment I thought I was safe, but then the metal began to warp. It started as a faint bulge in the center of the door, growing outward as though something was pressing against it from the other side. The metal groaned, the sound sharp and grating, and I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, overlapping in a chaotic symphony that made my head spin. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it did nothing to drown them out. I turned and ran. The aisle stretched ahead of me, the flickering lights casting erratic shadows that seemed to twist and writhe. The train car felt longer than it should have, the rows of seats stretching endlessly into the distance. As I ran, I realized I wasn't alone. There were more of them. The figures were scattered throughout the car, their dark forms barely visible in the dim light. They stood in the aisles, slumped in the seats, some even pressed against the windows as though trying to escape. They didn't react to my presence. Not at first. But as I passed, their heads, or what I assumed were heads, began to turn, following my movements with a slow, deliberate precision. I felt their attention like a physical weight, pressing down on me, threatening to crush me with its intensity. I reached the end of the car and grabbed the handle for the next door. This one opened easily, and I stumbled through without hesitation. The next car was different. It was bathed in a faint, sickly green light that seemed to ooze from the walls. The air was damp, carrying a metallic tang that made me gag. The seats were no longer uniform rows of molded plastic. They were warped, twisted, almost organic in appearance, like flesh stretched over bone. And then I saw her. A woman sat in one of the seats near the center of the car, her head bowed as though she were asleep. Her hair was long and dark, hanging limply around her face. She wore a tattered dress that clung to her thin frame, and her hands rested in her lap, fingers curled into fists. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. I took a cautious step closer. Her shoulders rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, the only sign that she was alive. "Are you okay?" I asked, keeping my distance. Her head snapped up. Her face was wrong. Her features were too sharp, her eyes too large and filled with a flickering light that seemed to pulse in time with the red glow outside. Her mouth was twisted into a grimace, her teeth unnaturally long and jagged. Before I could react, she stood, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. "Stay back," I said, my voice rising in panic. She tilted her head, studying me with an unnerving intensity. Then, without warning, she lunged. I turned and ran, my pulse roaring in my ears. Her footsteps echoed behind me, rapid and erratic, but I didn't dare look back. The door to the next car was just ahead, and I threw myself through it, slamming it shut behind me. The woman's face appeared in the window, her eyes glowing like embers. She banged against the glass with inhuman strength, the metal frame shaking with each impact. I backed away, breathing hard, and turned to face the new car. It was empty. No figures, no twisted seats, no sickly light. Just a cold, sterile silence that made the hair on my arm stand up. And then the door at the far end of the car opened on its own. The door at the far end of the car slid open with an eerie smoothness, revealing nothing but a dense, impenetrable blackness beyond. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The silence deepened, a suffocating void that pressed down on me from all sides. Behind me, the banging on the glass stopped abruptly. I glanced over my shoulder and saw that the woman was gone. The window was intact, the door unmoving. A faint smear of fog marred the glass where her face had been, but there was no sign of her or the figures. The only thing left was the open door at the far end of the car, waiting like an invitation. Or a trap. "Stay here," I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible. "Don't go any farther." But the train wasn't safe either. I could feel it, a rising tension in the air, like the charge before a lightning strike. I didn't know what was waiting in the next car, but staying here felt like waiting to drown in quicksand. I approached the open door, my legs trembling beneath me. The darkness beyond was total, as if the light from the car couldn't penetrate it. I hesitated at the threshold, my mind screaming at me to turn back, to find another way out. But then I heard the whispers again. They came from behind me, soft at first, like a breeze stirring dry leaves. Then they grew louder, more insistent, words I couldn't understand but felt deep in my chest. Something was coming. I stepped through the door. The darkness enveloped me instantly, thick and suffocating. I couldn't see, couldn't hear anything but the faint echo of my own breathing. My hands groped blindly in the air, searching for something, anything to ground me. And then, faintly, I saw it. A light. It flickered weakly in the distance, barely more than a spark, but it was enough to draw me forward. I stumbled toward it, the ground beneath me uneven and unsteady, as though the train had disappeared and left me adrift in some endless void. The light grew brighter as I approached, resolving into the shape of a small, flickering bulb hanging from a wire. It illuminated a narrow hallway, the walls lined with mirrors that stretched infinitely in every direction. I stopped in front of the first mirror and stared at my reflection. It wasn't me. The person in the mirror looked like me, same clothes, same face, but their expression was wrong. They stared back at me with wide, unblinking eyes, their lips twisted into a faint, knowing smile. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and touched the glass. It was ice cold, the chill seeping into my skin. The reflection's smile widened, and then it raised its hand before I did. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing down the hallway like 1,000 overlapping voices. The mirrors around me began to ripple, the reflections shifting and distorting. My own image disappeared, replaced by faces I didn't recognize, men, women, children, all staring at me with those same unnerving smiles. I turned and ran. The hallway stretched on endlessly, the mirrors blurring together into a kaleidoscope of shifting faces. The light above me flickered wildly, casting strange, warped shadows that seemed to reach for me as I passed. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get away. The whispers grew louder, the voices blending into a deafening roar. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside me, vibrating through my skull, drowning out every thought. And then I hit something. A door. It appeared suddenly, its surface old and splintered, as though it had been ripped from the entrance of an abandoned house. I didn't think. I grabbed the handle and shoved it open, stumbling through and slamming it shut behind me. The silence was immediate, as though the door had cut off the world behind it. I found myself in another train car, but this one was different. It was pristine, almost too perfect, with polished floors and gleaming seats. The air was still, the faint scent of cleaning chemicals lingering. A single window at the far end of the car revealed a landscape I couldn't comprehend, an endless expanse of shifting, jagged shapes that glowed faintly in shades of crimson and violet. I moved cautiously down the aisle, my footsteps echoing unnaturally. The car felt empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And then, at the very end of the car, I saw it. A figure, seated in the last row. It was different from the others, its form more solid, more defined. It was dressed in a dark suit, its face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat that cast a deep shadow. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, but the weight of its presence was overwhelming. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. I took a cautious step closer, and then another. The air grew colder with each step, a deep chill that bit into my skin. "Please," I said. "What is this? Where am I?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering me. Then it spoke. Its voice was low and resonant, like the rumble of distant thunder. "You shouldn't be here." "I don't understand," I said. "I just want to leave." "There is no leaving," the figure said. My chest tightened, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. There has to be a way out. The figure leaned forward slightly, and for the first time I saw its face, or the absence of one. Its features were smooth, blank, as though its skin had been stretched over a hollow void. "You boarded the last train," it said, "and the last train doesn't stop." The words echoed in my mind, twisting and distorting, until they were all I could hear. and then the car went dark. When the darkness swallowed me, it wasn't just an absence of light, it was a total void. I couldn't see, couldn't feel, couldn't even hear my own breathing. I reached out blindly, my fingers searching for anything solid, but there was nothing. Just the crushing blackness and the overwhelming sense of being somewhere I shouldn't be. Then, faintly, I heard it, a rhythmic, mechanical clanking, distant at first but growing steadily louder. It was the sound of wheels on tracks, like another train approaching. But it wasn't the reassuring sound of a normal subway car. It was deeper, heavier, as if the train was dragging something massive behind it. The ground beneath me trembled, and a sudden pressure built in the air, so intense it felt like my chest might collapse. And then, with no warning, the lights snapped back on. I was in the same car, but it wasn't pristine anymore. The gleaming seats were now torn and decayed, the polished floors warped and stained with dark smears that I didn't want to examine too closely. The window at the far end was shattered, jagged shards of glass framing that same impossible landscape of crimson and violet. The figure in the suit was gone. I didn't wait to question it. My instinct screamed at me to move, to run, to get as far away from whatever was coming as I could. I bolted down the aisle, weaving between the ruined seats, my footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent car. The door at the other end was closed, but as I reached for the handle, I felt a sudden resistance, like an invisible wall pushing back against me. My fingers grazed the metal, and a jolt of cold shot through my arm, paralyzing me. Behind me, the clanking sound grew louder. I turned, my stomach churning with dread, and saw the source of the noise. It wasn't another train. It was a mass of machinery and flesh, a grotesque amalgamation of twisting gears, pulsing veins, and jagged metal. It rolled through the car like a wave, consuming everything in its path. The seats crumpled like paper, the walls buckled, and the air itself seemed to warp and twist around it. And the faces. Dozens of faces, human and not, were embedded in the shifting mass. They opened and closed their mouths in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror, as though they were trapped in an eternal nightmare. I screamed and threw myself against the door, pounding on it with both fists. Let me out. The handle turned suddenly, and I fell through, landing hard on the floor of the next car. I scrambled to my feet, slamming the door shut behind me, just as the mass reached it. The door groaned under the pressure, the metal bending inward as though it might give way at any moment. I backed away, my heart racing, and turned to face the new car. This one was worse. The walls were covered in writing, long, looping sentences etched into the metal and dripping with a thick, black substance. The words were in a language I didn't recognize, but they hurt to look at, the jagged lines searing into my brain like a brand. The floor was soft, almost spongy underfoot, and it pulsed faintly, as though it were alive. The air was thick with the smell of decay, a sickly sweet stench that made my stomach churn. And the figures were back. They stood in the aisles, lined up like soldiers, their forms even darker and more distorted than before. They didn't move, didn't react, but I could feel their gaze on me, boring into my skull. I stepped forward cautiously, my breath shallow, and they parted like a curtain, creating a narrow path down the center of the car. It felt like a trap, but I didn't have a choice. The sound of the monstrous mass behind me grew louder, the door trembling under the strain. I walked down the aisle, the figures closing in behind me with each step. At the end of the car was another door, this one covered in the same black writing that adorned the walls. The words seemed to shift and writhe as I approached, the black substance dripping onto the floor and pooling at my feet. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. A voice whispered in my ear, low and guttural, a single word that sent a shiver down my spine. Enter. I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to fight my way through the figures, to do anything but open that door. But the clanking, grinding noise behind me was deafening now, and the air was filled with the sound of those trapped faces wailing in torment. With a shaking hand, I turned the handle. The door opened into a space that shouldn't have existed. It was vast, an endless expanse of black stone illuminated by a pale, flickering light that seemed to come from nowhere. The floor was covered in shallow pools of dark liquid, each one reflecting the twisted shapes of the figures that surrounded me. And at the center of the room was a massive clock. Its hands didn't move, frozen in place at a time I couldn't read. The face of the clock was cracked, the jagged lines radiating outward like a spiderweb. The figures formed a circle around the clock, their heads bowed in silent reverence. Then, one by one, they turned to face me. Their mouths opened, and the whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices overlapping and intertwining until they formed a single, coherent sentence. Time to choose. I staggered backward, my mind reeling. Choose? Choose what? The clock began to tick, the sound impossibly loud, each second echoing through the vast space like a gunshot. The figures stepped closer, their distorted forms shimmering in the pale light. The liquid beneath my feet rippled, sending dark waves across the surface. The ticking grew faster, more erratic, until it was a deafening roar. And then everything stopped. The figures froze, the clock fell silent, and the light dimmed. In the stillness, a single figure stepped forward. It was the man from the train, the one who had collapsed when the shadow touched him. But his face was blank now, smooth and featureless, his body moving like a puppet on invisible strings. He extended a hand toward me, and though he had no mouth, I heard his voice clear as day. Decide. What am I deciding? I shouted, my voice echoing in the silence. But he didn't answer. The clock began to tick again, slower this time, each second stretching into an eternity. And I realized, with a sinking dread, that I was running out of time. The hand reached closer, palm outstretched, as if inviting me to take it. I backed away, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The man or whatever he had become didn't follow. He just stood there, his featureless face locked in a stillness that was somehow more terrifying than if he'd been moving. Decide what I demanded again, my voice breaking. What do you want from me? The figures surrounding the clock began to sway, their forms rippling like heat haze. The whispering returned, louder this time, a cascade of overlapping voices that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere. The words were indecipherable, but the tone was unmistakable, insistent, demanding. The liquid beneath my feet churned, rising in waves that lapped against my ankles. It was cold, so cold it felt like shards of glass slicing into my skin. I flinched and looked down, but the liquid wasn't just water, it was alive. Shadows swirled within it, faces forming and dissolving, mouths opening in silent screams before vanishing again. The clock's hands jerked forward, moving in uneven, lurching motions. The sound was unbearable, a grinding, screeching noise like metal tearing against metal. And then the whispers merged into a single, deafening command. Choose. I turned back to the man, his hand still extended, and felt an overwhelming pull. It wasn't just the hand, it was the entire room. The figures, the clock, the shadows in the liquid. Everything seemed to be converging on this one moment, this one action. But choose what? I looked around frantically, searching for an answer, a sign, anything that would tell me what they wanted. My eyes fell on the clock, its face cracked and uneven. The hands were frozen at 2 minutes to midnight, twitching erratically but refusing to move forward. Time itself felt distorted, bending and stretching in ways that made my head spin. What happens if I choose? I asked, my voice trembling. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question, but he didn't respond. Instead, the figures surrounding the clock began to close in, their forms losing definition as they dissolved into swirling black mist. The mist coiled and twisted, snaking toward me like tendrils. I felt a pressure against my chest, as though invisible hands were pushing me forward. Wait, I said, backing away. I can't. Before I could finish, the ground beneath me shifted, and I fell. I plunged into the liquid, the icy cold swallowing me whole. The world became a blur of shadows and muffled whispers, the dark waves pulling me deeper and deeper. I kicked and thrashed, but it was like fighting against quicksand. The harder I struggled, the tighter it held me. And then I saw it. A light, faint and distant, pulsing in time with the erratic ticking of the clock. It was coming from below, a tiny point of warmth in the overwhelming cold. I reached for it, my lungs burning, my body screaming for air. The light grew brighter as I descended, illuminating the shapes around me. They weren't just shadows, they were people. Or what was left of them. Their bodies floated in the liquid, their faces twisted in expressions of terror and agony. Their eyes were open, unseeing, and their mouths moved soundlessly, as though they were trying to scream but had forgotten how. I wanted to stop, to turn back, but the current dragged me forward, inexorable and unrelenting. The light was close now, almost blinding in the darkness. I reached out, my fingers brushing against its surface, and the world around me shattered. I was standing again, back in the train car. But it wasn't the same. The seats were gone, the walls stripped bare, leaving only a vast, empty space. The figures were nowhere to be seen, and the clock had vanished. The liquid had receded, leaving the floor dry and cracked. And the man was there, standing in front of me. But this time he wasn't featureless. He had my face. I staggered back, my mind reeling. The man my double watched me with an expression of calm detachment, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "You've already chosen," he said, his voice a perfect echo of mine. "What are you talking about?" I demanded. "This train," he said, gesturing around us. "You boarded it, you stayed on it, you chose to come this far." "I didn't choose anything," I shouted. "Didn't you?" he asked, tilting his head. "You had chances to leave, to wake up, to turn back. But you didn't." The walls of the train began to tremble, faint cracks spiderwebbing across their surfaces. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of burning metal. "What happens now?" I whispered. My double stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "You become part of it." The floor beneath me cracked open, and the darkness surged upward, swallowing everything. I fell again, deeper and deeper, the whispers rising into a deafening crescendo. Faces and shapes flickered around me, their distorted forms merging and separating in an endless cycle. And then, abruptly, everything stopped. I was sitting in the subway car, my head resting against the window. The city lights blurred past, and the train rocked gently on the tracks. It was as if nothing had happened. But the faces. They were still there, faint and fleeting, reflected in the window. And in the distance I could hear the clock ticking.